Deaver here with Creator Space. It is Pi Day. Not like a pie that you eat, but Pi. It's a number. It's the ratio of any circle, circumference, divided by diameter. It always equals 3.14, and it goes on until infinity. But March 14th for 3.14 is always Pi Day. So practice your math. Measure circles, divide the circumference by the diameter, and see if you get 3.14. Today we're going to read Enemy Pie for Pi Day. I'm going to start story time once a week, so subscribe to this channel, get notifications so you can watch story time, or your parents can get the story time video for you to listen to. So this is Enemy Pie by Derek Munson. Enemy Pie. It should have been a perfect summer. My dad helped me build a new house in my backyard. My sister was at camp for 3 whole weeks. And I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was all good until Jeremy Ross moved in. He moved in right next door to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when he struck me out in the baseball game and had a party on his trampoline, and I wasn't even invited. But my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the one and only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved into the neighborhood, but as soon as he came along, I needed one. I hung it up in my treehouse where Jeremy Ross was not allowed to go.
Enemy number 1.
Dad understood stuff like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had enemies too, but he knew a way to get rid of them. I asked him, "Tell me how."
Huh?
"Tell me how. I'll show you how," he said. He pulled a really old recipe book out of the kitchen shelf. Inside, there was a worn-out scrap of paper with faded writing. Dad held it up and squinted at it. "Enemy Pie," he said. You may be wondering what exactly is in Enemy Pie. I was wondering too, but Dad said the recipe was so secret that he couldn't even tell me. I decided it must be magic. I begged him to tell me something, anything. "I will tell you this," he said. "Enemy Pie is the fastest known way to get rid of enemies."
It works every time.
Now, of course, this got my mind working. What kinds of things, like disgusting things, would I put in a pie for my enemy? I brought Dad some weeds from the garden, but he shook his head. I brought him earthworms and rocks. He didn't need those either. I gave him the gum I'd been chewing all morning, and he gave it right back to me. I went out to play alone. I shot baskets until the ball got stuck on the roof. I threw a boomerang that never came back to me. And all the while, I listened to the sounds of Dad chopping and stirring and blending the ingredients of Enemy Pie. This could be a great summer after all. Enemy Pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or worse, what it would look like. But when I got in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something really, really good. And as far as I could tell, it was coming from the kitchen. I was a bit confused.
It shouldn't smell this good.
I went in to ask my dad what was wrong. Enemy Pie shouldn't smell this good, but Dad was smart. "If enemy pie smelled bad, your enemy would never eat it," he said. I could tell that he had made enemy pie before.
It's worked on all of my enemies.
The buzzer rang and Dad put on the oven mitts and pulled the pie out of the oven. It looked like a plain old pie. I got a good look too. It looked even good enough to eat it. I was catching on.
Whoa.
But still, I really wasn't sure how this enemy pie worked. What exactly did it do to enemies? Maybe it made their hair fall out, or made their breath stinky. Maybe it made bullies cry. I asked Dad, but he was no help. He wouldn't tell me a thing. But when the pie was cooled, he filled me in on my job. He quietly talked. There's one part of the enemy pie that I can't do. In order for it to work, you need to spend a day with your enemy. And even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy. And that's the way the enemy pie can work. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Of course I was. It sounded horrible. It sounded scary, but it was worth giving it a try. All I had to do was spend one day with Jeremy Ross, and then he'd be out of my hair for the rest of my life. I rode my bike to his house and knocked on his door. When Jeremy opened the door, he seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. Can you play? I asked. He looked confused. I'll go ask my mom, he said. He came back with his shoes in his hand, and his mom came around the corner to say hello. You boys stay out of trouble, she said, smiling. When we rode bikes for a while and played to stopped to play on the trampoline. Then we made some water balloons and threw them at the neighbor girls, but we missed. Jeremy's mom made us lunch. After lunch, we went to my house. It was strange. I was kind of having fun with my enemy. He almost seemed nice. Of course, I couldn't tell Dad that, since he worked so hard to make that pie. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He said that he wished he had had a basketball hoop, but they didn't have room for one. I let him win a game, just to be nice.
Whoa, nothing but net.
Jeremy Ross knew how to throw a boomerang. He threw it and it came right back to him. I threw it and went over my house and into the backyard. When we climbed over the fence to find it, the first thing Jeremy noticed was my treehouse.
Whoa.
My treehouse was my treehouse. I was the boss. If my sister wanted in, I didn't have to let her. If my dad wanted in, I didn't have to let him. If Jeremy wanted in, can we go inside it, he said. I knew he was going to ask me that, but he was the only person on my enemy list. And enemies aren't allowed in my treehouse. But he did teach me how to throw a boomerang. And he did have me over for lunch. And he did let me play on his trampoline. He wasn't being a very good enemy. Okay, I said, but hold on.
Okay.
I climbed up ahead of him and tore the enemy list off the wall. I had a checkerboard and some cards in the treehouse, and we played games until my dad called us for dinner. We pretended not to hear him, and when he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him, but somehow he found us. Dad made us macaroni and cheese for dinner, my favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad after all. I was beginning to think that maybe we should just forget about the enemy pie. But sure enough, after dinner, Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he cut it into 8 thick slices. Dad, I said, it sure is nice having a new friend in the neighborhood. I was trying to get his attention and telling him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy. But Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he thought I was just pretending. Dad dished up 3 plates side by side with big pieces of pie and giant scoops of ice cream. He passed one to me and one to Jeremy. Wow, Jeremy said, looking at the pie. My dad never makes us pies like this. It was at that point I thought I panicked. I didn't want Jeremy to eat the enemy pie. He was my friend. I couldn't let him eat it. Jeremy, don't eat it. It's bad pie. I think it's poisonous or something. Jeremy's fork stopped before reaching his mouth. He crumpled his eyebrows and looked at me funny. I felt relieved. I had saved his life. I was a hero.
Oh, no.
If it's so bad, Jeremy asked, then why is your dad already eaten half of it? I looked at Dad, and sure enough, he was eating enemy pie.
What?
Good stuff, he mumbled through his mouthful. And that was all he said. I sat there watching him eat enemy pie for a few seconds. Dad was laughing. Jeremy was eating happily, and neither of them were losing their hair. It seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny bite. Enemy pie was delicious.
Yummy.
After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. He said that he'd teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make this stuff. I still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out or their breath turns bad. But I didn't know if I'll ever get the answer, because I just lost my best enemy. The end. Thanks for joining me for Pie Day and our first story time. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, turn on those notifications, and we'll see you next time.